So with every new season of Diablo 4, I like to try builds I've gone over in previous seasons and see how they stack up season to season. And the build we're going over in this video is no different, but I think this is the strongest version of this build that has ever been in Diablo 4. And this is going to be an endgame focused poison landslide build. And this version of the build is currently only using one unique and no mythics. Now, future versions of this build I'm going to go over is definitely going to be using more, but it's currently only using one unique, and that's one of the new uniques, which is the Mjolnir Ring. And the special of this is while Cataclysm is active, you gain unlimited spirit, which doesn't affect this build, and up to 100% increased multiplicative damage while Cataclysm is active. This is absolutely absurd, and this is the main reason we're using this ring. And this is actually going to change up this build quite a bit, because usually in these builds we'd use Petrify or something else, but in this version we're using Cataclysm. Cataclysm was also pretty heavily buffed, so now it doubles the rate which the lightning procs, and it causes the lightning to actually track enemies. So specifically on bosses, this is really good because you'll just machine gun lightning strikes on a singular target. And that brings us to our skill tree, starting with Storm Strike as our basic, and we're actually going to be using our basic a lot in this build. You're constantly spamming it. This will also give us some damage reduction. And upgrade 1 can immobilize enemies, upgrade 2 can make enemies vulnerable. And then we're going down to 5 points into Landslide. Now with this build, we're not going to have Landslide on our bar, but we're still going to be spawning landslides from a bunch of other effects, and those landslides are still going to be based off of our actual landslide ability. Now upgrade 1, landslide can immobilize enemies. Upgrade 2, when you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a terror mode. Each enemy hit by a landslide consumes a terror mode, causing it to be a guaranteed crit and deal increased critical strike damage, and bosses just have a chance to give you terror modes. And then we're going down and taking Earthen Bulwark. Now this was heavily buffed. This used to only scale off of your base life, so it'd give you a really small barrier. Now it's off of your max life. So as you can see, when I pop this, I get 20,000 barrier, which is massive. This will also go up from some other effects, so this is actually a big part of our defensives. Upgrade 1 makes us unstoppable. And then we're going down, we're taking Poison Creeper. There's two primary reasons we're taking this. First off, it poisons enemies, so that plays into a lot of other damage increasing effects, and Poison Creeper is one of the main ways in which we spawn our landslides. Upgrade 1 increases the duration of the immobilize and poisons. Upgrade 2 massively increases our critical strike chance against enemies strangled by this effect, and we're going to be constantly resetting this, constantly spamming it out. And then we're going down, we're taking Hurricane, and this again is to proc a bunch of other effects. Upgrade 1 slows enemies, and upgrade 2 makes enemies take less damage. And Hurricane actually deals some decent damage now, as quite a lot of the Druid abilities were pretty heavily buffed. And then we're going down, we're taking Trample, and this is the second way in which we're spawning our landslides. We'll trample, and it'll just spawn massive waves of landslides behind us. This also makes us unstoppable. And then finally, we're going down, we're taking Cataclysm as we went over. Upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2 makes enemies vulnerable for 6 seconds after being hit by Cataclysm. Now with all of our effects combined, our Cataclysm is currently lasting for 19.5 seconds, and we'll have ways to reduce this cooldown, so we'll want Cataclysm up as much as possible. And that brings us to our passive, starting with 1 into the Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Our core skills cost more but deal more damage. The cost doesn't matter, so this is just a big damage increase. Then we have 1 into Predatory Instinct for 3 into Iron Fur. You gain damage reduction while in Werebear and for 3 seconds after. Now our Trample puts us into Werebear, and we can constantly reset that, so we should have this damage reduction up a good amount of the time. And then 3 into Ancestral Fortitude just gives us increased resistances, and 3 into Vigilance for some pretty massive damage reduction after using a defensive. And we'll also be able to reset our Earthen Bulwark's cooldown, so we'll be able to have this up a decent chunk of the time as well. Then we're going down 1 into Elemental Exposure just to get 3 into Endless Tempest, increases the duration of Hurricane and Cataclysm. So this is another way in which we increase the duration of our Cataclysm, which when it's up, we're going to have massive damage increases. Then 1 into Crushing Earth, some increased damage for our Earth skills when enemies are CC'd, but this is to get 1 into Stone Guard. Critical strikes with Earth skills fortify you for 3% of your max life. Because we're spawning so many landslides, this will keep us 100% fortified most of the time. And then 3 into Stone Guard, while you have fortify for over 50% of your max life, your Earth skills deal increased damage. Then we're going 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You deal increased critical strike damage against poison enemies, and our poison creeper is constantly going to be poisoning everything. Then we're going down 3 into Defiance. Nature skills deal increased damage to elites. 3 into Natural Disaster. Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Storm skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. And then our 2 final points into Resonance. Nature magic skills deal increased damage. Triple this effect if an Earth skill is the next cast after a Storm skill, and vice versa. And that's how this build is going to work. Casting a Storm skill, then casting an Earth skill. And then finally, for our capstone, we have Nature's Fury. Casting an Earth skill is a 35% chance to trigger a free Storm skill of the same category, and vice versa. In addition, these free skills count as both Earth and Storm skills. And this is a really important part of the build because this mixed with one of our legendary aspects is how we reset all of our abilities constantly. And that brings us to our Spirit boons: Weariness to take reduced damage from elites, Avian Wraith for massively increased critical strike damage, Pack Leader, which is a lucky hit. Critical strikes have up to a 25% chance to reset the cooldown of your companion skills. Our Poison Creeper, which is a massive chunk of our damage. Then we have Calamity, extend the duration of our ultimate by 25%, which is our Cataclysm. And then Calm Before the Storm, another lucky hit. Nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds. This will allow us to stay in Cataclysm a majority of the time. And that brings us to our Paragon boards. Now, I'm primarily going to be going over the board and glyph selection. If you want to follow point by point, there'll be a build planner in the description where you can do that. Now, one of the main things when you're creating this for yourself is make sure you're getting your resistance capped and make sure you're going to have enough armor to also be capped. Those are some pretty important elements where you can change up some points to be able to help you in those areas a bit more. Now, on our first board, we're taking Territorial, increased damage to close enemies, and a damage reduction against close enemies. We're primarily going to be close enemies most of the time. Then at board 1, we're taking Heightened Malice. If 3 or more enemies are poisoned nearby, you deal massively increased damage. Poison Creeper will be poisoning everything. Then the glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, which buffs all magic nodes within range. Then nature skills do increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies, and we get some damage to poison enemies, some damage reduction from poison enemies, and then some increased stats. Then we're going over to the right, we're taking the Constricting Tendrils board. The glyph we're taking is Outmatch. This is a bonus to all rare nodes within range, and then you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. And what's really good about this one is we'll be getting some pretty big max life increases. We'll also get some nature damage and some increased willpower. Then we're going back over, we're going back up, and we're taking the Inner Beast board. The glyph we're taking is Tectonic, an increase to our Earth critical strike damage, but more importantly, we gain 20% lucky hit chance. This is really big, especially for our Poison Creeper resets. And also, when you're going to the next board, make sure to get the rare and magic nodes here that gives us increased attack speed. This is actually one of the big reasons why I take this board and set up my glyphs like this, because this is a lot of attack speed, and more attack speed is going to reset our abilities even faster. Then we're going over to the left, we're taking the Earthern Devastation board, which was buffed for the season. Your Earth skills deal increased critical strike damage, increased by your damage versus crowd controlled. And this caps at 60%, mine's capped at 60%. You're gonna want this. That's a 60% multiplicative scalar, which is pretty massive. Then the glyph we're taking is Spirit, increased critical strike damage, and critical strikes increase the damage enemies take from you by up to 12%. So another massive damage increase. Then finally, we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board, and the glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another buff to magic nodes within range, and a WoW and Werebear or a Werewolf, close enemies take increased damage from you. This will give us some core damage, some resistances, and some more increased stats. And that brings us to our gear. For your gems and your weapons, you want critical strike damage. On your gear, you want increased max life. And then on your jewelry, you want whatever gems are going to cap out your resistances. So you want all of those capped. And if you have those capped, you can also use a skull gem if you need additional armor to cap your armor. Make sure to scroll over your armor. It will tell you the cap, which is 9,230. And that'll give you the most damage reduction you can possibly get. Now, we already went over our unique ring. This is absolutely massive. Will just give us massive damage increases. And then for our legendary aspect, on our necklace, which is one of the most important ones, when the Nature's Fury key passive triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite type are reduced by up to 7.5 seconds. Now, I don't have a max roll on this. This build will actually get significantly stronger when you get a max roll. And basically how this works is we use storm skills that can give us free casts of earth skills, which will then proc this, lowering the cooldown of our earth skills. We then use our earth skills. Those can proc free storm skills, which will reduce the cooldown of our storm skills, just allowing us to constantly resets are Earthen Bulwark, our Poison Creeper, our Trample, and our Hurricane. And then for our other offensive aspects, you can put them on whichever gear pieces you want, doesn't matter where they go. But Poison Creeper's active also casts Landslide in a circle around you, and Earth Skills deal increased damage to poison enemies. So that's our first way we spawn our landslides. Then Trample now summons 6 landslide pillars of earth during its duration, dealing up to 100% normal damage. And Trample is now also a nature magic and earth skill, which is pretty important for synergizing with a bunch of aspects of this build. And then finally for our landslides earth pillars each strike a second time and deal up to 13% bonus damage per hit. So now when we cast a Trample, it spawns us big waves of landslides. It'll do that twice, and we use our Poison Creeper, it'll spawn landslides in a circle around us, and it will do that twice. Those 3 mixes is really what makes this build possible. And then for our final offensive aspect, your core skills deal up to 40% increased multiplicative damage based on your fortify, and we fortify so much all the time, this is just a massive damage increase. And then for our other aspects on my helm, I have when you have fortify, your earth skills gain +2 ranks, and gaining plus ranks 2 skills is multiplicative, so that's very good. This will also help give us more barrier from Earthen Bulwark, so it's just very good. And then on our chest piece, we have one of the new aspects. A percentage of the damage you would take is redirected across your companions, and your companions cannot die. Now, I'm actually not sure if this works because we're only using Poison Creeper. I couldn't find a single bit of information. I asked some people if they know if that actually works that way. I legitimately could not find an answer to this. It really wouldn't make sense that this doesn't work with Poison Creeper. There's only 3 possible companion skills for Druid. It wouldn't make sense that one of them just doesn't work with this. So presumably this should work. And then on our legs, basic skills give us 20% damage reduction. We're spamming Storm Strike at all times, so that's just more damage reduction, which is very strong. And then finally on our boots, I'm using another one of the new aspects that seems pretty good. Every 2 seconds, distant enemies are pulled into you and take 10% increased damage for 3 seconds. So this is multiplicative. Now this effect will go off on enemies you can't pull like bosses. You'll actually see the animation, but it still should give you that damage increase. So it's actually a pretty rare aspect in a non-offensive slot that just gives you some pretty big damage increase as well. And we're not going to go over all of our stats on gear. I will have all of the optimal stats in the build planner, so you can just easily go check that out as well. Now, some of the most important ones is on your weapons. Chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice from your tempering is super important. And likewise, you want a handful of your pieces to have the damage to crowd controlled enemies as tempers. I have this on a handful of pieces, and I think I can actually remove it. I have it on my offhand. I have it on my necklace. I have it on one of my rings, and then I have it on my gloves. Now, I don't think you need it on that many pieces because as you start to masterwork your gear, that will just upgrade and you'll cap out the legendary node in our Paragon boards to give us the most amount out of that. So I think most optimally would be to drop one of these and go with just another damage temper instead. And also some super important stats are your temperings on a lot of your armor pieces. And the main things you're going to want are just anything with CC, primarily anything with hard CC. Now, the main reason we want this is to be able to stun bosses because they take increased damage. They're stunned. They're not doing any abilities. This gives us some pretty big burst windows, just having a bunch of these lucky hit effects on pretty much all of our armor pieces. But that's the entirety of the build, and this is the strongest version of this build in Diablo 4's history. This build is just doing significantly higher damage than it was last season or previous seasons. It's still as tanky. It's always been tanky, but now it just does so much damage. Even when not factoring in the massive buff that this new unique ring can give us, this build just does a lot more damage. And when you get this ring, the damage is absolutely crazy when in Cataclysm, and I don't even have a max rolled version of this ring. I could get another 15% multiplicative damage just based off getting a better rolled version of this ring. So this build is definitely allowing you to do any end game content you want to right now, and it's still one of my favorite builds in the game to play. It's just super fun. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. Righteous. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment.